Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm joined now by John Tamny. He is the editor of Real Clear Markets, which you can find at RealClearMarkets.com. John, welcome back to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So you have a piece ran yesterday in Real Clear Markets, and the headline is, "Say it routinely, the Fed isn't, nor can it ever be, independent." And you write in part this, you say, the Fed is an outsourced creation of Congress whose officials are appointed by presidents and confirmed by Congress. Of course, it's political and the opposite of independent. So explain that, because one of the big complaints about Trump right now is that he wants to bend the current Fed chairman to his will and get him to lower interest rates. So who's independent here and who's in control?
Well, the very notion that the Fed's in control is laughable. Fed officials are appointed by politicians. To presume that they didn't politic to be in that position in the first place, to presume that they don't bend the wishes of presidents in the first place to please them, to basically, I know that they theoretically can't get fired, but that they don't bend to the wishes of politicians is laughable. This is a politically appointed entity. It's not necessary. I don't say that as a conspiracy theory. I just say that you don't need the Fed to regulate banks. You don't need the Fed to liquefy solvent banks. You certainly don't need the Fed to set interest rates. I mean, since when do Republicans think that a government entity can set an interest rate in the first place? At which point it's superfluous, which means it's by its very definition, its description, a politicized institution.
But I'm trying to understand what you're saying. Are you saying that the Fed doesn't have the power to set interest rates, or that the Fed chairman doesn't or listens to politicians? Why are we having this fight then?
Because politicians believe, and so do a lot of economists believe, that the Fed can set interest rates, which is laughable. The Fed is an interest rate follower. If the Fed could set interest rates, the U.S. economy would be too weak to even talk about, and we wouldn't be having this discussion because we'd be working in desperation just to feed our families. I mean, let's never forget the price of credit is the most important price in the world, other than possibly the dollar. And so this notion that the Fed is setting its cost, please, I mean, everyone's got a different interest rate. If you go to a bank today, your borrowing experience will be exponentially different from mine, from Jeff Bezos's, from name your person, because everyone's got a different income. Everyone's got a different situation. And so the idea that the Fed can decree the cost of something that's so important is just not serious.
But the Fed is setting the interbank interest rate. Is that, I mean, they're setting a rate, right? And you're not saying that they're not setting a rate.
Is it? The idea that banks would need the Fed to set a rate for the overnight lending, it's just not serious. And again, I don't say this as a conspiracy theorist. My view has always been that both sides vastly overstate the importance and power of the Fed. I'm just saying this as the idea that the Fed would need, or the banks would need the Fed to do that, or that the Fed has some major power to do that. Interest rates are set in the marketplace, and evidence supporting this claim is just travel back in time to when credit was allegedly costless. Remember when we were at zero all that time?
Right.
Well, so why then, when we were at zero, was Elon Musk literally talking about asking his wife's family at the time to borrow against their house because all of his businesses were running out of money? If credit was costless, couldn't he have just gone and gotten it for no price from banks? In reality, there was not an interest rate high enough for an Elon Musk to get equity credit, let alone lending credit, for much of the 2010s. That describes most businesses. Most businesses can't borrow at all, so they have to give up big portions of their in terms of equity in order to get any kind of capital at all. And so I just think this focus on the Fed is kind of odd.
And so how do you explain the sort of White House's sort of focus on getting the Fed chair to lower interest rates? Well, what explains the sort of fascination there?
Well, the people I've talked to are close to Trump. They say that Trump says, well, I like low interest rates, except for he hasn't had a low interest rate in years. I mean, and we know that. And how we know that is that Banks, when he was a private citizen, had largely shut their doors to him. Deutsche Bank was the only one. Other major banks were no longer lending to him because he was no longer a credit risk. And so I think with Trump, there's a little bit of showmanship, precisely because media, left and right, still focus on the Fed as though what it does actually moves the cost of credit. I think he wants to be seen as the person decreeing lower credit costs, but
Mhm.
let's just agree that it's much easier said than done. I mean, let's look at the most dynamic sector of the U.S. economy today. Most would agree it's Silicon Valley.
Mhm.
Yet there's no startup out there that borrows money. And there isn't because there's no interest rate high enough for those startups to be loaned to at. And the reason for that is just about every startup in Silicon Valley fails. And so here we have not just the most dynamic sector of the US economy, but a sector of the US economy that quite literally drives the global economy. If you took Silicon Valley out of it, the global economy would be exponentially smaller. Yet they don't. Do you think they follow the Fed? Why
Right.
would they?
But
There's
what about
nothing that the
mortgage
Fed does
rates?
that
What
can
about
affect what
credit card
happens to them.
rates? I mean, those are the things we are told are sort of tied to the Fed's decisions. Is that true or not?
Oh gosh, I mean, what's your rate? What's mine when I run up a tab at Visa or
Well,
American
I
Express?
know that if I went to my bank and refinanced rates, my home mortgage right now, I would pay a higher rate than I got, say, when I did it, which was 10, 15 years ago, I guess.
No, and no doubt that's true, but why is it true? Is that because banks are basically following the Fed, or is Fed following banks?
Mm,
Certainly, when you look at when rates were lower in the 2000s uh, from banks and people were borrowing fairly cheaply to buy houses, largely what that was banks just rushing away from risk. I mean, it's
hmm.
easy to forget that housing is kind of a safe loan, and the reason for that is there's a recoverable asset if people stop paying it. And
Right,
so interest rates on housing are always going to be low because it's non-risky. Whereas if you lend to an individual or you lend to a business, the
right,
individual could disappear. The individual could
right.
walk it. The individual could die. Same with the business, and there's nothing to get back. And so I think a lot of this it speaks to what's true. The economy is much better than it was in the 2000s. And so banks are taking bigger risks. And because they are, they're not so willing to lend as cheaply to housing.
Huh. Yeah, you're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm talking to John Tamny. He's the editor of Real Clear Markets. So, what do you think is the proper role for the Fed, or do we even need a Fed? From your point of view, it sounds like maybe we don't even need one.
No, we don't. Let's be clear. And again, I don't say this as some wild-eyed Austrian school person who thinks the Fed is the source of all of our economic ills. Again, the books I've written about the Fed make a case that it's just not that important one way or the other. Do we need it? Of course not. And how you know we don't need it is that any bank that runs into near-term credit difficulties, as in it's solvent, but it needs cash in the near term, it would never go to the Fed.
Uh-huh.
And the reason it would never go to the Fed is because to go to the Fed for a loan is a signal that voluminous market-based sources of credit passed on you. So for a bank to go to the Fed for a loan is for a bank to admit that it's bankrupt.
Mm,
And that's why banks avoid it.
hmm.
It's not something that can be hidden. And so you don't need the Fed exists. It's an outsourced creation of Congress, not to prop up solvent banks. Markets already do that. The Fed exists. It's an outsourced creation of Congress precisely to prop up insolvent banks. So the Fed leans against the market's message. I don't think that's a good thing. The Fed regulates banks, but well, we know from 2008 that it's not a very good regulator of banks. It couldn't see into the future, which we shouldn't expect it to. And so you'd rather private lenders essentially regulate banks, watch over them than the Federal Reserve. It's just a bunch of economists. At which point the Fed, as we've discussed, presumes to set some kind of overnight market lending rate. But I mean, honestly, do we really think banks need the Fed for this? I
Mm,
mean, just hopefully the question answers itself. Banks don't need the Fed for this. And so the Fed, of course, it's superfluous and it keeps looking for a purpose, as all bureaucracies do, because It's the biggest employer of economists in the world. It's got a huge base of employees that, well, they need jobs, and so they're always looking for things. But no, we don't need the Fed.
So in a perfect world, John, we got about a minute left here. In John Tamny's perfect world, does the Fed go away? Does it shrink to a small enough that it could be put in the bathtub? Or what's your view of what's your
Oh, in
perfect
my
Fed?
perfect world, the Fed would disappear because it serves no purpose. But that's never going to happen. It's never going
Mhm.
to happen because it's a full employment act for economists. It's also a way for Congress to basically outsource the dirty stuff about bailing out banks that markets no longer would prefer to go under in the first place. And
Mhm.
so you're never going to get rid of the Fed. What I do think will change over time is that gradually people will become wise to the truth that, again, if the Fed were a fraction of as powerful as people assume in terms of its ability to set the cost of credit, we'd be in a world of economic trouble. And we know this because central planning fails always and everywhere. I mean, the surest sign that the Fed's not that important when it comes to credit costs is the abundant nature of the U.S. economy.
Mhm.
So the Fed will always be with us. I just think both sides overstate its import. It's just not that big of a deal.
Wow. Well, okay, great stuff. I've been talking to John Tamny. He is the editor of Real Clear Markets. You can find his latest article as well as a bunch of other good stuff at RealClearMarkets.com. So check it out. I'm Andrew Walworth. That's our program for today. Thank you for listening. We'll be back here with more Real Clear Politics tomorrow. Have a great evening.